The Ghost of Mae Nak. In the heart of old Bangkok, during the reign of King Rama IV, nestled by the Chao Phraya River, was a small village called Phra Kaew. The village was known for its tranquility, but it would soon be etched into the annals of history for a story so tragic, so terrifying, that it would be whispered about for generations. Mak was a young soldier, strong and brave, who had grown up in Phra Kaew. He was deeply in love with Nak, a beautiful woman whose grace and kindness made her beloved by all who knew her. They were married in a small but joyful ceremony, and their love for each other was the stuff of legend in the village. Not long after their marriage, Nak became pregnant, and the couple eagerly awaited the birth of their child. But just as Nak's belly began to swell with life, war broke out, and Mak was called away to fight for the king. With a heavy heart, he left Nak, promising to return to her and their unborn child. The months passed slowly for Nak as she waited anxiously for her husband's return. The war dragged on, and there was little news from the front. Nak's labor pains came early one rainy night. The midwives in the village rushed to her aid, but complications arose. Despite their best efforts, Nak died in childbirth, her spirit unwilling to leave the world, tethered by her deep love for Mak and their newborn son. The village mourned Nak's death, but the tragedy did not end there. The baby, too, died shortly after birth, leaving the villagers in sorrow. They buried Nak and her child in the village cemetery, performing the necessary rites to ensure her spirit would rest in peace. But Nak's love for Mak was so strong that it defied death itself. Her spirit remained bound to the house where they had lived, awaiting Mak's return. After the war ended, Mak returned to Phra Kaew, eager to reunite with Nak and meet his child. As he approached his home, he was puzzled by the cold reception from the villagers. They avoided him, their faces pale and fearful. But Mak was too excited to care, all he wanted was to see Nak and their child. To his surprise, Nak greeted him at the door, as beautiful as ever, holding their healthy-looking baby in her arms. Mak, overwhelmed with joy, believed he had been blessed by the gods. They lived together again as husband and wife, just as before, with Nak taking care of him and their home. However, strange occurrences began to happen. Whenever Mak was away, the villagers whispered about the ghost living in his home. They had all seen Nak's funeral, and they knew the truth, that Nak was no longer among the living. But Mak, blinded by love and happiness, refused to believe their warnings. One day, as Mak was preparing betel leaves to chew, he dropped a lime. It rolled across the floor and under the house. Nak, sitting beside him, stretched her arm impossibly long to retrieve it. Mak was horrified but said nothing. He started to notice other odd things, how Nak never left the house during the day, how she never ate with him, and how she was always cold to the touch. The truth was finally revealed by an old friend who could no longer bear to see Mak living with a ghost. The friend took Mak to the local temple, where the abbot explained Nak's tragic death. Mak's heart broke, but he could no longer deny what he had seen. That night, he feigned sleep, and when Nak believed he was asleep, he fled to the temple. Nak's ghost, realizing what had happened, flew into a rage. Her wails echoed through the village, and she began to terrorize anyone who had tried to come between her and Mak. The villagers lived in fear, unable to escape the wrath of Mae Nak. Desperate, the villagers sought the help of a powerful monk, Someday too, who was known for his ability to communicate with spirits. The monk arrived at Phra Kaew, carrying sacred relics and chanting ancient prayers. Nak's spirit, powerful and angry, confronted the monk, but he was prepared. Someday too spoke to Nak with compassion, acknowledging her pain and love for Mak. He told her that it was time to let go, that her attachment to the world of the living was causing suffering. Nak, seeing the truth in his words, finally agreed to leave. But her love for Mak was so strong that she asked for one last favor. The monk agreed, and he performed a powerful ritual to trap Nak's spirit inside a small piece of bone from her forehead. He sealed it in a clay pot and buried it in the temple grounds, where it would remain undisturbed for centuries. Nak's spirit, though no longer free to roam, was finally at peace. Mak, heartbroken but free from the terror that had plagued him, left Phra Kaew, never to return. The village slowly returned to normal, but the story of Mae Nak became legendary. To this day, the story of Mae Nak Phra Kaew is told in hushed tones, a reminder of the power of love and the terror of a spirit that refuses to let go. Some say that her spirit still lingers in the area, watching over the village she once called home, and that if you visit her shrine with pure intentions, she might grant you a blessing. But be careful not to anger her, for the wrath of Mae Nak is something no one would want to face. The Hungry Ghost of Phi Kaew. Nong Pru was a quiet village nestled deep in the heart of Thailand's countryside, far from the bustling cities and modern conveniences. The villagers were simple folk, living off the land and adhering to the ancient traditions and superstitions passed down through generations. Life was peaceful until a terrible tragedy struck, changing the village forever. It began one fateful night during the monsoon season. The rains were particularly harsh that year, and the river that ran through Nong Pru had swollen beyond its banks. A small group of villagers, including women and children, had taken refuge in a wooden house built on stilts near the river. They were hoping to wait out the storm, but nature had other plans. The river burst its banks in the middle of the night, the flood waters sweeping away everything in their path. The house on stilts collapsed, and the people inside were caught in the raging current. Their cries for help were drowned out by the roar of the water, and by morning, there was nothing left but debris scattered across the muddy landscape. When the flood waters receded, the villagers found the bodies of the victims tangled in the branches of trees or buried in the mud. The sight was horrific, and the tragedy cast a dark shadow over Nong Pru. The villagers performed the necessary funeral rites, hoping to send the spirits of the dead peacefully to the afterlife. But something went wrong. The deaths had been violent and unexpected, and the spirits of the victims, known in Thai folklore as Phi Kaew, were restless and angry. Their hunger for revenge and justice would soon haunt the living. A few weeks after the tragedy, strange things began to happen in Nong Pru. At first, it was just small, unsettling occurrences, windows that opened by themselves, eerie whispers in the night, and shadows that moved without a source. The villagers dismissed these as tricks of the mind, remnants of their grief and shock from the recent loss. But the incidents quickly escalated. One evening, an elderly woman claimed to have seen a ghostly figure standing at the edge of the village, drenched and muddy, staring at her with hollow, black eyes. The figure vanished when she approached, but the woman was left with a feeling of intense dread. The next day, the body of a young man was found near the riverbank, his face twisted in terror. There were no signs of a struggle, no wounds or injuries, but his eyes were wide open, as if he had seen something so horrifying that it had stopped his heart. Panic spread through the village as more strange deaths occurred. Each time, the victims appeared to have died from sheer fright, their bodies discovered in their homes, fields, or by the river. The villagers were gripped by fear, convinced that the spirits of those who had died in the flood were exacting their revenge. Desperate for answers, the villagers sought out Kru Nang, an old and respected shaman who lived in the nearby mountains. Kru Nang was known for his ability to communicate with the spirit world, and the villagers hoped he could help them rid Nong Pru of the vengeful ghosts. The shaman listened carefully as the villagers recounted the strange occurrences and the growing number of unexplained deaths. He nodded solemnly and then, after a long silence, spoke with a grave tone. "The spirits of the dead are indeed among you," Kru Nang said. "They are the Phi Kaew, souls who have died violently and prematurely. Such spirits are restless and angry, and their hunger for revenge is unquenchable. They seek to bring others into the afterlife with them, to share in their suffering." The villagers were horrified. They begged Kru Nang to perform a ritual to send the spirits away, to cleanse their village of this dark presence. But the shaman shook his head. "It is not so simple," he warned. "The Phi Kaew are powerful and relentless. They will not leave until they are satisfied. You must find a way to appease them, or their wrath will consume you all. Kru Nang agreed to help the villagers, but he warned them that the ritual to appease the Phi Tai Hong would be dangerous and that there were no guarantees of success. The ritual required a special offering, something that would soothe the anger of the spirits and convince them to leave the village in peace. The villagers gathered the necessary items, food, incense, flowers, and personal belongings of the deceased. The shaman instructed them to build a small shrine near the river where the flood had occurred, a place where the spirits could be called forth and addressed. As night fell, the villagers gathered around the shrine, their faces pale with fear. Kru Nang began the ritual, chanting ancient prayers and calling upon the spirits of the dead to come forward. The air grew thick with tension, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees like the wails of the lost souls. Suddenly, the atmosphere grew cold, and the villagers felt a presence among them, something unseen but undeniably there. The spirits had arrived. Kru Nang spoke to the spirits, offering the food and incense, asking for forgiveness on behalf of the living. He pleaded with the spirits to accept the offerings and leave the village in peace. The villagers held their breath, waiting for a sign that the spirits had been appeased, but the wind only grew stronger, and the ground beneath the shrine began to tremble. The spirits were not satisfied. As the ritual seemed to be failing, one of the villagers, a young woman named Kamon, stepped forward. Kamon had lost her younger sister in the flood, and the pain of that loss had never left her. With tears in her eyes, she called out to the spirits, begging them to take her instead. She offered her life in exchange for the safety of the village. The villagers gasped in shock, but Kru Nang, understanding the gravity of her sacrifice, did not stop her. He knew that the spirits needed something more than offerings, they needed a willing soul to guide them to the afterlife. The wind suddenly died down, and the trembling stopped. The villagers felt a change in the air, a sense of calm, as if the spirits were considering Kamon's offer. Then, the temperature dropped even further, and Kamon collapsed to the ground, her body limp and cold. The villagers rushed to her side, but it was too late. Kamon had given her life to the spirits, and in doing so, she had appeased their hunger. The ritual site fell silent, and the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the village for weeks lifted. The spirits had been satisfied, and Nong Pru was free from their wrath. Kamon was laid to rest with great honor, her bravery and sacrifice never forgotten by the villagers. They believed that she had not only saved them but had also guided the lost souls of the Phi Tai Hong to their final resting place. In the years that followed, Nong Pru returned to its peaceful existence. The villagers continued to honor the memory of those lost in the flood and of Kamon, who had given her life to protect them. They built a shrine in her honor, where they would leave offerings and prayers, asking for her continued protection. But even as the village moved on, the story of the hungry ghosts of Nong Pru remained a cautionary tale, a reminder of the thin veil that separates the living from the dead. And on stormy nights, when the river swelled and the wind howled, the villagers would remember the tragedy that once befell their home and the spirits that had haunted them. For in Thailand, the dead do not always rest, and the Phi Tai Hong are always hungry. The Curse of the Naree Pon. In the dense jungles of northern Thailand, where the trees grow tall and the underbrush is thick, there exists a legend passed down through generations. The villagers speak of the Naree Pon, mythical trees that bear fruit in the shape of beautiful women. These trees are said to be sacred, guarded by powerful spirits, and anyone who dares to disturb them will be cursed with unimaginable misfortune. The Naree Pon, according to legend, are the creations of ancient forest spirits. They grow in remote areas, hidden from the eyes of the unworthy. The fruit, resembling miniature women with delicate features and graceful limbs, are said to have magical properties. Some believe that they can grant eternal youth and beauty, while others say they are the embodiment of the spirits themselves, watching over the forest. But the legend comes with a warning: those who take the fruit without the blessing of the forest spirits will suffer a terrible curse. The spirits are fiercely protective of their creations, and the curse they bestow is said to be relentless and unforgiving. Dr. Somchai Watanakul was a renowned botanist, known for his expeditions into the wildest, most uncharted regions of Southeast Asia. His passion for discovering new species of plants had taken him to the deepest jungles, where few dared to venture. Over the years, he had collected hundreds of specimens, many of which had been previously unknown to science. But Dr. Somchai was restless. He had heard the stories of the Naree Pon from the local villagers during his last expedition, and the idea of discovering a mythical tree intrigued him. He dismissed the villagers' warnings as mere superstition and became obsessed with finding the Naree Pon. The idea of adding such a legendary specimen to his collection was too tempting to resist. After months of research and planning, Dr. Somchai set out on an expedition deep into the northern jungles, accompanied by a small team of local guides and porters. The journey was treacherous, the terrain unforgiving, but the promise of discovering the Naree Pon kept him going. One day, after weeks of searching, Dr. Somchai stumbled upon a hidden grove deep within the jungle. There, in the center of the grove, stood a single tree unlike any he had ever seen. Its bark was smooth and pale, its leaves a deep, vibrant green. And hanging from its branches were the fruit, small, delicate figures that looked like miniature women, their faces serene and otherworldly. Dr. Somchai's heart raced with excitement. He had found the Naree Pon. Ignoring the warnings of his guides, who refused to go near the tree, Dr. Somchai carefully approached the Naree Pon. He examined the fruit, marveling at their lifelike features. They seemed almost to breathe, their tiny chests rising and falling with each breath of wind. He knew he should take only one, but the allure of the tree was too strong. He plucked 2 of the fruits from the tree, placing them gently into a specimen bag. As he did, the wind seemed to pick up, whispering through the trees in a language he couldn't understand. A sense of unease settled over him, but he brushed it off as nerves. Dr. Somchai hurried back to camp, eager to study the fruits in detail. The guides, their faces pale with fear, begged him to leave the fruit behind, but he refused. They warned him of the curse, but he laughed it off, insisting that science was above such superstitions. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy silence, the jungle around them came alive with strange sounds. The wind howled through the trees, and the air grew thick with an oppressive heat. Dr. Somchai was too absorbed in his study to notice the growing tension among his team. But the night held more than just eerie sounds. As Dr. Somchai slept, he was plagued by nightmares. He dreamed of the Naree Pon tree, its branches reaching out to him like grasping hands. The fruit he had taken transformed into vengeful spirits, their delicate faces twisted with anger. They whispered curses in his ear, their voices hissing like snakes, promising pain and suffering. He awoke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The tent was filled with a strange, sweet scent, like that of rotting fruit. Dr. Somchai's unease grew, but he dismissed the dream as a figment of his imagination, the result of his exhaustion and excitement. The next morning, the porters reported that one of their own had vanished during the night. His bedroll was empty, and his belongings were untouched. The guides, now visibly shaken, insisted that the jungle spirits had taken him as punishment for disturbing the Naree Pon. Dr. Somchai, though troubled, refused to believe that the disappearance had anything to do with the fruit. He pressed on, determined to return to civilization with his prize. But as they journeyed back through the jungle, more strange incidents occurred. Equipment went missing, food supplies spoiled overnight, and members of the team fell ill with mysterious ailments. One by one, the porters began to desert, leaving Dr. Somchai and his few remaining companions to fend for themselves. By the time Dr. Somchai reached the outskirts of the jungle, he was a shadow of the man who had entered it. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt and hollow, and his eyes filled with fear. The fruit he had taken from the Naree Pon tree now seemed to pulse with a life of its own, growing heavier in his bag as if they were alive. That night, as they camped near the edge of the jungle, Dr. Somchai was awakened by a strange sound. He opened his eyes to see the fruit he had taken glowing with an eerie light. The tiny figures began to move, their limbs stretching and twisting as they grew larger, transforming into ghostly apparitions. The spirits of the Naree Pon had come to claim their revenge. They surrounded Dr. Somchai, their voices a cacophony of anger and sorrow. They spoke of the curse, of how he had defiled the sacred tree and stolen from the spirits. The jungle around them seemed to come alive, the trees closing in, the ground beneath him shifting and moving as if it were breathing. Dr. Somchai tried to run, but his feet were rooted to the ground, held fast by unseen forces. The spirits descended upon him, their cold hands grasping at his body, pulling him down into the earth. His screams echoed through the jungle, but there was no one left to hear them. By morning, Dr. Somchai was gone, and the jungle had reclaimed him. The Naree Pon tree stood once more in solitude, its fruit hanging peacefully from its branches, waiting for the next foolish soul to disturb it. When the few remaining members of Dr. Somchai's team returned to the village, they were broken men, haunted by what they had witnessed in the jungle. They spoke in hushed tones of the curse of the Naree Pon, of how the spirits had taken their leader and punished those who had dared to defy them. The villagers, knowing the truth of the legend, performed rituals to appease the forest spirits, offering prayers and gifts to ensure that the curse would not follow them home. They spread the story of Dr. Somchai's fate far and wide, a warning to all who might be tempted by the allure of the Naree Pon. In the years that followed, the legend of the Naree Pon grew, and the tree became a symbol of the power and mystery of the jungle. Many came in search of it, lured by the promise of beauty and eternal youth, but few returned. And those who did return spoke of the jungle as a place where the boundaries between the living and the spirit world are thin, where the spirits of the Naree Pon watch over their sacred grove, waiting for the next trespasser to fall into their trap. For in the heart of the jungle, the Naree Pon tree still stands, its fruit as alluring and deadly as ever, a reminder that some legends are not just stories, but warnings of the dangers that lie in the unknown. The legend of the Phi Pop. In a remote village in the Isan region of northeastern Thailand, a curse loomed over the villagers like a dark cloud. The village was small, with houses made of wood and thatch, and the people lived simple lives, relying on farming and fishing to sustain themselves. But beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful existence was a fear that kept the villagers on edge, fear of the Phi Pop. The Phi Pop is one of Thailand's most feared spirits, a malevolent entity that possesses its victims and devours their internal organs, leaving them to die a slow and agonizing death. The spirit is said to move from person to person, always searching for a new host. Those possessed by the Phi Pop often appear normal during the day but are tormented by the spirit at night, their bodies wasting away as the spirit feeds on their life force. The villagers believed that the curse of the Phi Pop had been placed on their village many years ago, after a powerful sorcerer had been wronged by one of their ancestors. In his dying breath, the sorcerer had vowed to haunt the village forever, sending the Phi Pop to exact his revenge. Since then, the spirit had claimed many lives, and the villagers lived in constant fear of being its next victim. One day, a stranger arrived in the village. She was a young woman named with long black hair and striking features. Was a healer, known in the neighboring villages for her knowledge of herbs and traditional medicine. She had heard of the curse of the Phi Pop and had come to offer her help, hoping to find a way to break the curse and free the villagers from their torment. The villagers were wary of at first, but their desperation outweighed their suspicion. They welcomed her into their community, hoping that she might be the one to end the curse. Set up a small clinic in an old, abandoned house at the edge of the village, where she began treating the sick and injured with her herbal remedies. But as settled into the village, strange things began to happen. Animals were found dead in the fields, their bodies mysteriously drained of blood. People started falling ill with strange symptoms, fatigue, weakness, and a gnawing pain in their stomachs. Whispers spread through the village that the Phi Pop was growing stronger, feeding off the life force of its victims in preparation for its next possession. Could feel the presence of the spirit, lurking in the shadows, watching her every move. She knew that she had to act quickly if she was to save the village from the Phi Pop's wrath. The village elder, Kun Yai, was the first to fall seriously ill. He was a respected leader, a man who had guided the village through many hardships, and his sudden decline sent shockwaves through the community. Kun Yai's condition deteriorated rapidly, he grew thin and frail, his skin pale and clammy, and he was plagued by terrible nightmares. Visited Kun Yai daily, trying to ease his suffering with her herbal remedies, but nothing seemed to work. It wasn't long before the villagers began to suspect that the Phi Pop had possessed their beloved elder. The signs were all there, the wasting body, the hollow eyes, the fevered muttering in his sleep. One night, as sat by Kun Yai's bedside, he suddenly awoke with a start. His eyes were wide and filled with terror, and his voice was barely more than a whisper as he spoke. "The Phi Pop is here," he said. "It's inside me. It wants to kill us all." Felt a chill run down her spine. She had read about the Phi Pop, had heard the stories, but this was the first time she had come face to face with the spirit's power. She knew that if she didn't act quickly, the Phi Pop would claim Kun Yai's life and then move on to another victim. But how could she fight a spirit as powerful and malevolent as the Phi Pop? Knew that traditional medicine would not be enough, she needed to find another way. Spent the next few days researching everything she could about the Phi Pop. She spoke to the villagers, listened to their stories, and pored over ancient texts that described rituals and spells designed to banish evil spirits. Finally, she found a ritual that she believed could exorcise the Phi Pop from Kun Yai's body and trap it forever. The ritual was dangerous, and there was no guarantee of success, but knew that it was their only chance. She gathered the necessary ingredients, sacred herbs, blessed water, and a special talisman that had been passed down through generations of her family. She also prepared a powerful incantation that would draw the spirit out of Kun Yai and into the talisman, where it could be contained. That night, under the light of the full moon, and a group of villagers gathered in Kun Yai's home. The air was thick with tension, and the villagers watched with bated breath as began the ritual. She lit the herbs, their smoke filling the room with a pungent scent, and sprinkled the blessed water over Kun Yai's body. As she chanted the incantation, Kun Yai's body began to convulse, his face contorting in pain. The room grew cold, and a dark shadow seemed to descend over them. The villagers could feel the presence of the Phi Pop, its anger and hatred palpable in the air. But did not falter. She continued the ritual, her voice growing stronger as she recited the final words of the incantation. The talisman in her hand glowed with a bright, otherworldly light, and the shadow in the room seemed to writhe in agony. Suddenly, with a blood-curdling scream, the Phi Pop was torn from Kun Yai's body and drawn into the talisman. The air grew still, and Kun Yai collapsed onto the bed, his body limp but alive. The villagers erupted in cheers, their fear replaced by relief. The curse had been lifted, and the Phi Pop was no longer a threat to their village. In the days that followed, Kun Yai began to recover, his strength slowly returning. The villagers praised for her bravery and skill, grateful that she had saved them from the Phi Pop's curse. Was relieved, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right. The talisman, which she had placed in a sacred box in her clinic, seemed to pulse with a strange energy. At night, could hear faint whispers coming from the box, as if the spirit of the Phi Pop was trying to escape. One night, unable to ignore the whispers any longer, opened the box. To her horror, the talisman was cracked, its light dimming. The Phi Pop was breaking free. Before could react, the spirit burst forth from the talisman, its dark form looming over her. It had grown stronger, feeding off the fear and pain of the villagers, and now it sought revenge on the one who had tried to trap it. Knew that she was out of time. She had to find a way to destroy the Phi Pop once and for all. But the spirit was too powerful now, and she was alone. The Phi Pop lunged at her, its hands like icy claws. Fought back with all her strength, using every spell and incantation she knew, but it was no use. The spirit was relentless, its anger fueling its attacks. In a last-ditch effort, grabbed the broken talisman and threw it into the sacred fire that burned in the corner of her clinic. The talisman erupted in flames, and the Phi Pop screamed in agony as it was consumed by the fire. The clinic filled with smoke, and could barely breathe. But she refused to let go, chanting the incantation over and over as the fire burned brighter and hotter. Finally, with one final, ear-piercing scream, the Phi Pop was destroyed. Collapsed to the floor, exhausted but victorious. The curse was broken, and the village was safe. But the experience had left her shaken, and she knew that she would never be the same. The village returned to normal in the weeks that followed. Kunyai made a full recovery, and the villagers slowly began to rebuild their lives, free from the fear of the Phi Pop. But the memory of the spirit's terror lingered, a reminder of the darkness that had once plagued their home. Remained in the village, continuing her work as a healer, but she was forever changed by her encounter with the Phi Pop. She became more cautious, more aware of the unseen forces that lurked in the shadows, and she was always vigilant, ready to defend the village from any threat. The villagers, too, learned from the experience. They honored the spirits of the land with renewed reverence, ensuring that they did not anger the forces that could bring such devastation upon them. And they never forgot the courage of the healer who had saved them from the wrath of the Phi Pop. As the years passed, the story of the Phi Pop became a legend, told around campfires and passed down through generations. It served as a warning to all who would dare to underestimate the power of the spirit world, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. But the legend also carried a deeper lesson, that sometimes, the greatest battles are fought not with weapons or strength, but with knowledge, courage, and an unwavering determination to do what is right, no matter the cost. The Haunted Floating Market. It was a sweltering afternoon when the group of tourists arrived at the famous Dam in Sajuak floating market, just outside Bangkok. The market was a riot of colors and sounds, with longtail boats laden with fresh fruits, vegetables, and handcrafted goods floating along the narrow canals. The tourists, a mix of young backpackers and curious travelers, marveled at the vibrant atmosphere, snapping pictures and haggling with the vendors. Their guide, a local woman named Noi, was enthusiastic, sharing tales of the market's history and the cultural significance of the floating markets in Thailand. But as she spoke, her tone grew somber. She mentioned that the market had a dark past, but quickly brushed it off as mere superstition, not wanting to spoil the cheerful mood. The group didn't think much of it. They were here to enjoy the experience, not to dwell on old tales. As the day wore on, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. The tourists lingered, enchanted by the golden glow that bathed the market in an otherworldly light. But as the sun set, the atmosphere began to change. The bustling energy of the market gradually faded, and a strange stillness settled over the canals. The vendors, who had been so lively and welcoming, now appeared distant, their faces blank and expressionless. The water, once sparkling and clear, turned murky, reflecting the deepening dusk like a dark mirror. One of the tourists, a young man named Jake, noticed something unsettling. The boats that had been filled with produce and goods were now eerily empty, and the few remaining vendors seemed to be staring at him with hollow, unblinking eyes. He felt a chill run down his spine, but when he tried to mention it to the others, they brushed it off, convinced it was just the fading light playing tricks on his mind. As night fell, the group decided it was time to head back to their hotel, but when they tried to find their way out of the market, they realized that the canals had changed. The once familiar paths were now a confusing maze of waterways, and no matter which direction they turned, they always seemed to end up back where they started. Panic began to set in as the realization dawned on them: they were trapped. Noi, now visibly uneasy, confessed the truth about the market's dark history. Years ago, during a busy festival, a fire had broken out in the market. The narrow canals and tightly packed boats turned into death traps as the flames spread rapidly. Dozens of people, both vendors and shoppers, had perished in the inferno, their bodies lost to the murky depths of the canals. Since then, the market had been haunted by the restless spirits of the victims, forever reliving the tragic event. The tourists were skeptical, but their skepticism quickly turned to fear when they began to hear strange sounds, the crackling of flames, the panicked cries of people, and the eerie creaking of boats that weren't there. The air grew thick with the scent of smoke, and the shadows around them seemed to come alive, flickering like the remnants of a long-forgotten fire. The group huddled together, their fear growing as ghostly apparitions began to appear around them. The spirits of the dead, vendors clutching charred goods, children with hollow eyes, and shoppers with expressions frozen in terror, emerged from the shadows, their forms translucent and flickering like dying embers. The apparitions paid no attention to the living, instead replaying the tragic events of that fateful night over and over again. The tourists watched in horror as the ghosts relived their final moments, trapped in an endless loop of suffering and despair. As the night dragged on, the tourists found themselves drawn deeper into the heart of the market, unable to escape the relentless cycle of tragedy. Every turn they took led them back to the scene of the disaster, where the ghosts continued their haunting reenactment. Jake, who had been trying to keep a level head, began to notice something strange. The ghosts weren't just reliving the past, they were interacting with the present. One by one, the tourists started to see visions of the fire reflected in the water, and they felt the heat of the flames on their skin. It was as if they were being pulled into the past, forced to experience the horror firsthand. Noi, who had been trying to keep the group together, was the first to succumb. She collapsed to her knees, clutching her head as the visions overwhelmed her. The others rushed to her side, but it was too late. Noi's eyes glazed over, and she began to speak in a voice that wasn't her own, recounting the events of the fire in chilling detail. It was then that Jake realized what was happening. The spirits were trying to communicate, to share their story with the living. But more than that, they were seeking something, closure, perhaps, or a way to finally rest in peace. Desperate to find a way out, Jake convinced the others that they needed to uncover the truth behind the tragedy. He believed that the spirits were trapped because something had been left unresolved, something that had kept them bound to the market for all these years. They began to explore the market, searching for clues that might reveal the secrets of the past. As they did, the apparitions grew more active, their forms becoming more solid, more real. It was as if the spirits were guiding them, leading them to the hidden truth. In the back of an abandoned stall, Jake found an old, charred ledger that had somehow survived the fire. The pages were brittle and covered in soot, but he could still make out the names of the vendors and the inventory they had lost in the blaze. As he flipped through the pages, he came across a name that sent a shiver down his spine: Somchai. Noi had mentioned earlier that the fire had been started by a vendor who had been cooking in his boat when the flames accidentally spread. His name was Somchai. Jake shared his discovery with the group, and they realized that Somchai's ghost might hold the key to ending the curse. They needed to find his spirit and help him find peace. The group made their way to the center of the market, where they found the spirit of Somchai. He was standing in his boat, staring into the water with a look of profound sorrow on his face. The flames of the fire flickered around him, but he seemed oblivious to them. Jake approached the ghost, speaking softly so as not to startle him. He told Somchai that they knew what had happened, that they understood he hadn't meant to cause the fire. He asked Somchai to forgive himself, to let go of the guilt that had kept him trapped in the market for so long. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Somchai turned to face them. His eyes were filled with tears, and he nodded, a look of relief washing over his features. The flames around him began to die down, and the oppressive heat that had been suffocating the tourists began to fade. As the ghost of Somchai began to dissolve into the air, the other spirits in the market started to follow suit. The apparitions flickered one last time before disappearing, leaving the market eerily quiet. With the spirits gone, the tourists found that the market had returned to its normal state. The confusion of the canals had vanished, and they were able to navigate their way out with ease. The night was calm, the air cool and refreshing, as if the market itself had been cleansed of the dark presence that had haunted it for so long. As they left the market, the group was silent, each of them processing what they had just experienced. They knew that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Noi, who had regained her composure, thanked Jake for his quick thinking and bravery. She told the group that they had done something that few others could, help the restless spirits find peace. The tourists returned to their hotel, grateful to be alive but forever changed by their encounter with the supernatural. The market, once a place of terror, was now at peace, its dark past finally laid to rest. But the memory of the haunted floating market would linger in their minds, a reminder of the thin veil that separates the living from the dead, and the power of unresolved guilt to keep spirits trapped in a never-ending cycle of suffering. The vengeful spirit of Nong Tani. In the dense jungles of northern Thailand, a young monk named Phra Kaew was making his way along a narrow, winding path. The thick canopy above cast deep shadows on the ground, and the air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and blooming orchids. Phra Kaew, a devout and pious man, had been traveling for days, seeking a remote monastery where he hoped to deepen his practice and meditate in solitude. The journey had been arduous, but Phra Kaew was undeterred. His mind was clear, his heart pure, and his spirit unwavering. He had taken vows of celibacy, poverty, and humility, dedicating his life to the teachings of the Buddha. The jungle, with its serene beauty and natural solitude, seemed the perfect place to distance himself from the temptations of the world. As he walked, the sounds of the jungle surrounded him, the calls of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of a branch. But there was something else, too, something that made him pause. It was a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, carried on the wind. Phra Kaew stopped, listening intently, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. He shrugged it off as a trick of his mind and continued on his way. The path soon led him to a clearing where a grove of banana trees stood tall and proud, their broad leaves swaying gently in the breeze. The sight of the trees filled him with a strange sense of unease. He had heard stories of the spirit Nong Tani, a female ghost who was said to haunt banana trees, particularly those that grew in isolated areas like this. But Phra Kaew was not one to be swayed by superstition. He took a deep breath, recited a short prayer, and prepared to walk through the grove. As he did, a sudden chill ran down his spine, and he felt a presence watching him. He glanced around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the banana trees, their leaves rustling softly in the wind. As Phra Kaew moved deeper into the grove, the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. The air seemed to thicken, and the jungle sounds became muted, as if the world around him was holding its breath. He felt a sense of dread building within him, but he pushed it aside, reminding himself of his purpose and the strength of his vows. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw her, a woman, standing among the banana trees. She was strikingly beautiful, with long, flowing black hair, pale skin, and eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. She wore a traditional Thai dress, the fabric shimmering as if woven from moonlight. The sight of her was so unexpected, so surreal, that Phra Kaew stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. "Nong Tani," he whispered, recognizing the spirit from the legends. The woman smiled, a slow, seductive smile that sent shivers down Phra Kaew's spine. She stepped forward, her movements graceful and fluid, as if she were floating rather than walking. Phra Kaew felt a powerful urge to approach her, to reach out and touch her. But he knew better. This was no ordinary woman, she was a spirit, and a vengeful one at that. Nong Tani's voice was soft and melodious as she spoke. "You are brave, young monk, to travel alone through this jungle. But bravery can be dangerous. Are you not afraid of what you might encounter?" Phra Kaew swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. "I have taken vows," Nong Tani. I am not swayed by fear or temptation. I seek only peace and enlightenment. The spirit's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Peace and enlightenment, she echoed. But what of desire? What of the yearnings of the flesh? Even the most devout cannot escape such temptations. Phra Kaew closed his eyes, reciting a prayer under his breath, trying to block out her words. He knew that engaging with her could lead to disaster. But her voice, like a siren's call, was difficult to ignore. You cannot resist me forever, Nong Tani whispered, her voice now close to his ear. Your vows may protect you, but they will not save you if you break them. Phra Kaew's heart raced, but he stood firm, refusing to give in to the fear and desire that threatened to overwhelm him. He kept his eyes closed, praying for strength, until he felt the presence begin to fade. When he finally opened his eyes, Nong Tani was gone. The grove was silent once more, but the tension in the air remained, like a coiled serpent waiting to strike. Phra Kaew continued his journey, but the encounter with Nong Tani weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit was still watching him, waiting for him to slip up, to break his vows. The path became more treacherous, the jungle more foreboding, as if the very land itself was conspiring against him. As night fell, Phra Kaew decided to rest in a small clearing by a stream. He built a modest shelter and prepared to meditate, hoping to clear his mind and regain his focus. But as he sat in the lotus position, his thoughts kept drifting back to Nong Tani. Her beauty, her voice, her presence, it was all too vivid, too real. He knew that breaking his vow of celibacy, even in thought, would have dire consequences. In the Buddhist tradition, such a transgression was considered a grave sin, one that could lead to spiritual downfall. Phra Kaew reminded himself of this, trying to banish the thoughts from his mind. But the jungle was full of distractions. The rustling of leaves, the calls of nocturnal animals, and the occasional snap of a branch kept him on edge. And then there was the persistent feeling that he was not alone, that Nong Tani was still near, lurking in the shadows, waiting for him to falter. In his exhaustion, Phra Kaew's resolve began to waver. He felt his eyelids grow heavy, his mind drifting between wakefulness and sleep. In that vulnerable state, the line between reality and dream blurred, and he found himself back in the banana grove, facing Nong Tani once more. This time, she did not speak. Instead, she reached out to him, her fingers brushing his hand. The touch was cold, sending a jolt of electricity through his body. Phra Kaew jerked awake, his heart pounding, realizing that he had let his guard down, even if only for a moment. He had broken a sacred rule, he had allowed himself to be tempted, to entertain the thought of desire, even in his sleep. The jungle, once a place of serene beauty, now felt like a prison. The air was thick with tension, and the once clear path was now overgrown and treacherous. Phra Kaew could feel Nong Tani's presence growing stronger, her anger palpable in the very air he breathed. He knew he had to atone for his mistake, but the question was how. The Buddhist texts he had studied spoke of rituals and prayers to cleanse one's soul, but they were meant for the temple, not the heart of the jungle. Phra Kaew's mind raced as he tried to recall the teachings that might save him. As he walked, the sky darkened unnaturally, and a sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, bending them as if they were made of paper. The temperature dropped, and the once vibrant jungle was now a desolate, shadowy landscape. Phra Kaew knew that he was no longer in the world of the living but had crossed into a realm dominated by Nong Tani's wrath. The spirit appeared before him, her form more terrifying than before. Her beauty was now a mask for the fury that burned in her eyes. Her voice, once soft and enticing, now echoed with the power of a storm. "You have broken your vow, monk," she hissed, her voice reverberating through the trees. "And now, you will pay the price." Phra Kaew dropped to his knees, bowing his head in supplication. "Nong Tani, I beg you for mercy. I did not intend to break my vow. It was a moment of weakness, and I seek to atone for my sin." But Nong Tani was unmoved. The ground beneath him trembled, and the trees around him groaned as if in pain. "There is no atonement for a broken vow," she declared. "You will suffer as I have suffered, and your soul will be bound to this place for eternity." Phra Kaew felt despair wash over him, but he refused to give up. He began to recite a prayer, one he had learned long ago, meant to purify the mind and spirit. The words came slowly at first, but as he continued, his voice grew stronger, more confident. Nong Tani's anger seemed to waver for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "Your prayers are useless," she spat. "You cannot undo what has been done." But Phra Kaew did not stop. He continued to pray, his voice steady and unwavering. He knew that this was his only chance, that he had to reach the spirit within Nong Tani. The Cursed Amulet of Wat Phra Kaew. The ancient temple of Wat Phra Kaew stood majestically in the heart of Bangkok, its golden spires reaching toward the heavens, shimmering in the sunlight. The temple, home to the revered Emerald Buddha, was a symbol of Thailand's spiritual heritage, attracting pilgrims and tourists from around the world. But among the crowd of visitors, one man had come not for spiritual enlightenment, but for something far more tangible: treasure. Jack Malone was a seasoned treasure hunter, known for his daring exploits and uncanny ability to find ancient artifacts. He had traveled the world, from the pyramids of Egypt to the jungles of South America, always in pursuit of the next big score. And now, his eyes were set on a prize that few would dare to seek, a sacred amulet hidden deep within the temple of Wat Phra Kaew. The amulet was said to possess unimaginable power, a relic of ancient times, blessed by the gods themselves. But with that power came a terrible curse, one that brought death and destruction to anyone foolish enough to claim it. Jack had heard the stories, but he dismissed them as mere superstition. To him, the amulet was just another artifact to be sold to the highest bidder. As Jack made his way through the temple grounds, he couldn't help but admire the intricate carvings and statues that adorned the walls. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and the chanting of monks echoed through the halls, creating an atmosphere of solemn reverence. But Jack's mind was focused solely on his mission. He had spent weeks researching the temple, learning its layout, and identifying the location of the amulet. Now, he was ready to strike. In the dim light of the temple's inner sanctum, Jack spotted the amulet. It was nestled within a niche, surrounded by offerings of flowers and candles. The amulet itself was a small, intricately carved piece of jade, set in gold and adorned with precious gemstones. It was beautiful, even mesmerizing, and Jack could feel its pull as he approached. Just as he reached for the amulet, a voice broke the silence. "Stop. You must not touch it." Jack turned to see an elderly monk standing in the doorway, his face etched with concern. The monk's eyes were sharp, his expression grave as he stepped forward. "This amulet is sacred," the monk warned. "It is protected by powerful spirits. If you take it, you will bring great suffering upon yourself." But Jack was not a man to be easily dissuaded. "I've heard the stories, old man, but I don't believe in curses," he said, his voice laced with arrogance. "This amulet belongs in a museum, not gathering dust in some temple." The monk's expression darkened. "You are making a grave mistake. The amulet is not just a relic, it is a vessel of divine power. It was placed here to protect us, and taking it will unleash forces you cannot comprehend." Jack ignored the monk's warnings, his hand closing around the amulet. As soon as he touched it, he felt a chill run down his spine, but he dismissed it as a momentary lapse in judgment. With the amulet in hand, he turned and walked out of the temple, leaving the monk to watch helplessly as he disappeared into the night. Jack made his way back to his hotel, the amulet safely tucked away in his bag. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him, but he attributed it to the monk's ominous words. "It's just a bunch of superstitious nonsense," he muttered to himself, trying to dispel the lingering dread. But as the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The air in his room grew cold, the lights flickered, and Jack felt an unseen presence watching him. He tried to sleep, but his dreams were filled with terrifying visions, images of shadowy figures, burning temples, and the sound of agonized screams. He awoke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the amulet glowing faintly beside him. The next day, Jack's luck took a turn for the worse. His car broke down, his flight was cancelled, and he narrowly avoided a serious accident in the crowded streets of Bangkok. Everywhere he went, he felt the same eerie sensation, as though something was following him, lurking just out of sight. Desperate to escape the growing sense of dread, Jack decided to leave Thailand as quickly as possible. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted. He began to see glimpses of ghostly apparitions in the corners of his eyes, spectral figures dressed in ancient robes, their faces twisted in anger and pain. Jack's fear turned to desperation as the events escalated. His health began to deteriorate rapidly, his skin grew pale, his eyes sunken, and he was plagued by a persistent cough that only grew worse with each passing day. The amulet, once a source of pride, now felt like a heavy burden, a constant reminder of the curse he had unleashed. One night, as Jack lay in bed, too weak to move, he heard the voice of the monk in his mind, echoing the warning he had ignored. "You must return the amulet, or the spirits will claim your soul." With the last of his strength, Jack made the decision to return to Wat Phra Kaew and seek forgiveness. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, the curse would consume him completely. The journey back to Wat Phra Kaew was arduous. Jack's condition had worsened, and he struggled to walk, each step a painful reminder of his impending doom. The streets of Bangkok, once bustling with life, now seemed distant and alien, as though he were walking through a nightmare from which there was no escape. When he finally reached the temple, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the golden spires. Jack could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, the spirits growing more restless as he approached the inner sanctum. The temple was empty, save for the monk who had warned him before. The monk's expression was one of sadness and resignation as he saw Jack's condition. "You have returned," the monk said softly, "but I fear it may be too late." Jack fell to his knees, holding out the amulet with trembling hands. "Please, take it back. I beg you," he pleaded, his voice hoarse and desperate. "I didn't know. I didn't believe." The monk took the amulet from Jack, his touch gentle but firm. "The spirits are angered, but there may still be a chance for redemption," he said. "You must atone for your greed and seek their forgiveness." With the monk's guidance, Jack performed the rituals necessary to appease the spirits. He lit incense, offered prayers, and made offerings of food and flowers. The monk chanted ancient verses, calling upon the spirits to show mercy. As the ritual progressed, Jack felt a strange sensation, a warmth spreading through his body, pushing back the cold that had gripped him for days. The ghostly apparitions that had haunted him began to fade, their anger replaced by a sense of peace. When the ritual was complete, the monk placed the amulet back in its niche, where it belonged. The air in the temple grew still, the oppressive weight of the curse lifting from Jack's shoulders. He could feel his strength returning, the sickness that had ravaged his body receding. But the monk's expression remained somber. "You have returned the amulet, and the spirits have been appeased," he said. "But the curse has left its mark on you. You cannot undo the past, but you can choose a different path moving forward." Jack nodded, humbled by the ordeal he had endured. "I've learned my lesson," he said quietly. "I won't make the same mistake again." With the monk's blessing, Jack left Wat Phra Kaew, a changed man. He had sought treasure, but what he found was far more valuable, a newfound respect for the power of the sacred, and a deep understanding of the consequences of greed. As he walked away from the temple, the sun rose over Bangkok, casting a warm, golden light over the city. The curse had been lifted, but the memory of what he had experienced would stay with Jack forever, a reminder that some things are not meant to be taken, no matter the price.